Hello and welcome back to my series for International Women's Day, where I speak to lots of inspirational women about their experience and expertise. I'm really excited today to be joined by Rachel Vorona Cote, whose book Too Much is all about Victorian constraints and how they still restrict our lives today. So hopefully this episode will get a little bit of historical context around why women are sometimes seen as too much and how that affects our lives even now. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it, and here we go. Hi Rachel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very excited. So like I mentioned before we started recording, I'm currently reading Too Much, and as I started reading, I was like, I have to have you on this series.
I'm honored. Thank you.
So do you want to tell the viewers a little bit about what your book Too Much is all about?
Sure. Yeah. It's the title is the full title is Too Much: How Victorian Constraints Still Bind Women Today. It's kind of a unwieldy title, but the basic premise is that there's this sort of cultural narrative around women and femmes that we're sort of pathologically excessive, fundamentally excessive, and that excess is just pathologized in all sorts of ways. So, you know, oftentimes this is attached to anything that regarding emotional expression. So, you know, women are too emotional, and then if you're a woman, woman identified person, and you're you know claiming space in any way, that too becomes a sort of excessiveness. So if one is openly sexual, or or fat,
Or just anything, really.
really anything. Yeah, you know, if you have mental illness of some sort, any sort of unwieldiness, anything that can't that can't be easily shunted to the side, is by its very nature illegible. It's almost as if it's both it's sort of a paradox, like it's quintessentially feminine and yet not feminine because you're not the right sort of woman.
And something that I found really interesting in the first, it's just in the first chapter, and sort of like when you're introducing the idea why you sort of started writing the book, something that I thought was just made me sort of go yes, was when you went, I think the example you just gave as well, so if you show any sort of emotion, you're too emotional, but then if you don't show any sort of emotion, then you're too hard. Like it's always this too muchness, and I love how you tie it into Alice in Wonderland and all that kind of stuff, because I'm a big fan. But it's that whole idea of just being too much anything, I think is really interesting. And what I've really started finding so interesting, so every time I read a section of your book, I'm always just like, oh yeah, like some of it's kind of like, oh yeah, I do that, or like, oh, that does happen to me, or oh, that does that. And I'm finding it so interesting looking at sort of the historical context like around that. So your background, you did a PhD in Victorian literature, is that right?
Almost. I was working on my dissertation, and then I ended up making a difficult decision to leave and focus on writing outside of academia. But it had, I mean, that training has obviously impacted me and informed everything that I do. But yeah, I don't want to claim to a title that I didn't fully get. But yeah, that's my background. I was writing a dissertation when I began sort of thinking about this topic.
Yeah, but it changes the whole, so I'm a year into my PhD, and
Oh,
I feel like
awesome.
it changes the whole way you think about everything. So whether or not you
Yeah.
finished it or not, you've kind of got that frame of mind where you read something and then you just start analyzing it. I'm not going to say over analyzing, but you kind of just pick it apart, and then you
Mm-hmm.
start seeing things that you didn't see there before. What was that?
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned at the beginning of the book, like what prompted you writing it, but do you want to tell the people watching what sort of made you go, actually, like this is a book that I need to write. This is something I need to explore more.
Yeah, I think it was both it was both intensely personal, that decision, and also intellectual, and of course the boundary between the personal and the intellectual,
Yeah.
they they're mutually constitutive. But I you know I was interested um in the idea of excess, and in this, the way that excessiveness is sort of uh, pathologized. At least, I'm talking about Western uh, culture. Um, I, I can't, that I can only speak from my experience. And it was uh, it that was of course interesting for the, sort of self-absorbed reason that, I'm a very emotional person. And from little girlhood, it felt as if I had sort of moved through these various stages, sometimes interlapping, often interlapping, stages of excess, of too muchness. That when I was little, I was intensely sensitive chatterbox um, you know, who was sometimes, would find herself upset or agitated by things,
Mhm.
and couldn't really predict. I was Because I was little and didn't have the language or the self-awareness. Um, and uh, and I'd often be told to shush,
Mhm.
to lower my voice.
Yeah.
And then as I got older, one starts understanding how to move through the world, and of course some of that was was just growing more mature, and learning empathy, that okay, um any movement through the world, like, has to be a negotiation with the people around us. And there's always going to be a negotiation between what we need and what they need. But even with that, and I am by no means I'm by no means a perfect person. I'm always trying to get that right. But it felt that even apart from that, even apart from this the sort of efforts that we have to make, um, in order to just be kind, compassionate, functional people in the world, that there was this sort of uh, larger cultural need for uh, for any sort of outsized uh, expression of um, anything,
Yeah.
joy, upset, fear, uh body weight, horniness, whatever, like, that these things needed, that those of us who maybe uh were were inclined to show more, needed to do much less,
Mm.
uh to sort of safeguard, who knows what, a sense of decorum, obviously to assuage a sort of larger anxiety. And it felt to me as if, often this sort of policing was very focused on femininity. I mean, this is where you know much of the agitation uh, was seemed to be uh, born from. And my work, at the same time, my work in Victorian studies and Victorian literature, dovetailed with these sorts of observations in a interesting way, because I don't have to tell you that the Victorian period in England was sort of the height of hysteria diagnoses, and hysteria was by no means born uh, in the 19th century, but it's things sort of reached a fever pitch in
Yeah.
terms of the way that women were diagnosed, and of course, and women really were, had a hell of a time getting the medical
Yeah.
treatment that they did need in the 19th century. Um, but hysteria became this sort of catch-all for a woman really being, you know, uh, out of line in any way. Hysteria could be caused apparently by reading novels, or
Heaven forbid.
yes, yes, you know. But and the symptoms, I mean, if you read like uh lists of the symptoms of hysteria, I mean, it's just hilarious, because it's like literally just living and breathing.
Yeah.
Would
Oh, first question, are they a woman? Yes, hysteria must be.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, yes.
I think it's really interesting because even research now has shown that when, so if like women are experiencing mental health problems, this is something
Mhm.
that I read a few weeks ago, but if women are experiencing mental health problems, and I think this research was done in Europe, I don't know if it was in England, but it was in Europe, um, and they were saying that when women go to the doctors or they go and like say things, they ask them questions, they still ask them questions like, oh, where are you in your cycle when you're feeling like that, where are you, and they somehow still find ways to blame the fact that they're women, as opposed to going, yeah, do you know what, that is a mental health issue, we have these chemical, it's a chemical imbalance, or oh, it's this, it's causing that. They don't even look at it, they always find reasons to not look at it because they're women.
Yeah.
I can send you the paper, it was very interesting.
Yeah. No, and it's really perniciously essentialist, because gender is we've been talking now for years about the fact that gender is a construct that
Yeah.
being woman identified doesn't
Yeah, it doesn't
necessarily
even mean
mean
that you are,
anything at all.
yeah. And it doesn't even mean that you are, you were born a woman, it means that you identify as a woman, and
Yeah.
then suddenly you're put into this bracket. And I read this really interesting, again saying different things that I've read, can you tell I'm doing research in gender at the moment? I
Yes,
read this
it's wonderful, it's
really
exciting.
interesting story about a trans man who was saying how, because he's experienced PMS, he's experienced having periods, that his girlfriend now thinks that he's so much more empathetic, and it's kind of shown him both sides of it. And that was just such an interesting kind of perspective of this man who's gone through what women have gone through and now is on the other side of it. And he was saying that he now gets taken much more seriously, and it's so weird to see that difference in how like all these issues are treated. I just thought it was really interesting.
Huh. Taken seriously by his partner, by doctors, or
So in the context, it was by his partner. His partner was
okay.
like, oh, you're a lot more yeah, but then obviously it
Mhm.
raises lots of issues, but when people outside of his close bubble,
Sure.
because trans
Yeah.
people are up against so much. But that's a separate conversation for now.
Yeah.
So what surprised you most when you were looking at all these kind of issues of like hysteria, how women were treated in Victorian times and how that flows through to today? What surprised you the most when you were doing that research?
Oh, I think there's so just the process. I think the discovery process of doing research, there's always there's so much surprise, just little and big, and so um it's such a wonderful process of discovery. I often sometimes I'll try to figure out if I was surprised at how much or how little things had changed, and it's hard, and it's kind of hard to know.
Yeah.
I reading uh the conduct books that I talk about in later on. I think it's still, even knowing what I do, it's still shocked me a little bit
Yeah.
just how sort of maniacal they were in the sort of the their argument for just total self-policing. And and it's sort of interesting considering that you know this is the period of the Industrial Revolution, that women were sort of on the one hand unwieldy, and also being asked to treat their bodies almost as like these
Yeah.
mechanized beings, and to sit ever thus so, and to modulate your voice and everything, to be perfectly pleasing. um you know i I think, uh i think was I, I probably was hoping that I would see a bit more progression.
Yeah.
Um, and there is a sort of weariness, I think, that comes when you realize that it's the same stories that have
Yeah.
the same narratives that have just sort of held on tenaciously, and you find yourself thinking, God, are we really still talking about
Yeah.
this? Like, are we really still having these conversations? Like, can't we talk about something else? Like,
Yeah.
are we really, are we still talking about whether women identify persons who are public figures? Are we really still obsessing over how emotional they seem? Like,
Hmm.
how is this the case? But at the same time, we have there there has been, we have made strides, largely because of the activist effort of the most marginalized among us. Um, but then, the these issues of excessiveness, whatever I've experienced a a white cisgender bisexual woman, I, I'm, that's going to be experienced tenfold by trans and non-binary persons, by women of color, and and I, in the book, I I try to gesture to that. There's certainly a lot more to be said, and I hope that
Yeah.
much more will be said, because the conversation around emotional policing and uh, our sort of cultural reception of emotion is something that I think we need to talk about,
Yeah.
uh, in the most non-binaristic ways possible. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's so there were moments where I was just kind of like, oh my God, it's, come on, man, like,
Yeah.
put some
No, and it is,
reality.
and I feel like I'm totally on board. It's like these conversations seem to have been happening for so long. Like, even like you go back and it keeps getting mentioned, and yet it still feels like we're still starting the conversation.
Yeah,
Even like you say, we've made so many strides. Women can open their own bank accounts now. They can own
yeah,
property. Like, even just things like that, and yet we're still having to have conversations. And this is the thing for the series International Women's Day. We shouldn't need an International Women's Day, but
right,
we still need that because
right,
of all these issues that are still happening. And it's,
right.
yeah, so I can imagine looking at it, you were kind of, okay, yeah, so this has moved on, but also what about all these things? We still have all these issues that we still need to deal with. I imagine that was quite, maybe not eye-opening, but quite difficult to digest.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, the on the one hand, yeah, there's this sort of pleasure in resonance, and you read uh, the Brontes or George Eliot and think, oh gosh, they really had their finger on the pulse, and then you
Mm.
think, well, how long have we needed to keep our finger on that pulse? Like, if they were talking about this in like the 1850s, you
Yeah.
know. Um,
Yeah. And then, like you say, that's not even kind of including people who are not
yep,
cisgender, who are people like women of
absolutely.
color and all that kind of stuff. And it's, yeah, and this kind of narrative that, okay, we need to fix gender equality before we fix it for other people. And it's like, we need to fix all of it. It's all important.
Yeah,
We do need to
yeah.
keep bringing it forward. And I think, yeah, I feel like we're just both going, yeah, it's just annoying.
It's the best kind of conversation.
I think sometimes it is that though, isn't it? Sometimes you just want to know that, hey, we're not alone in this. Sometimes
Yeah.
we need to talk about it more, and I think especially we need to talk about it with men more. We need to talk about it with, everyone really. But then, like you say, I quite often when I bring up issues of gender and things at work, because I work in IT, they go, "Oh, Alice is talking about that again." It's that whole idea of being too much. Like I've mentioned it more than once. It's too much. Like you've mentioned it once. We know it's an issue, but I'm like, you're still not doing anything about it.
Right.
But it's that whole too much thing. I think it's really interesting when you were saying like when you were younger, you had all these kind of things and it was your emotion, that kind of thing. I was always labeled as bossy, like when I wanted to play games and that kind of, I was always bossy. And now I work in project management, and somehow now being organized and taking leadership positions is kind of a good thing. And it's like you can't have it both ways. You can't label us as one thing when we're young and then kind of expect us to do that. I think it's really interesting kind of that you mentioned that as well, from my experience anecdotally.
And even if it's good, it's good, but I imagine it, even taking that sort of authority can be problematic depending on who's on the receiving end.
Yeah.
White men don't like to be told what to do.
Nope. No, sadly not. Yeah. So what advice would you give to the women, and Ben I guess as well, who are watching this, to sort of break free? Because like you say, the subtitle of this book is these Victorian constraints that still kind of mold how we are now. What advice would you give to people to try and break free? Big question this. How do you solve the issue of, gender inequality? What small thing or what advice would you give to people to kind of break free of these constraints?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I'm in a position to give anybody advice on this, but I guess one thing I would say is that the story you are told about yourself, you don't have to accept it. You know, the um, we're always being given information about who we are, but uh, and it can be really, really hard to uh, to sort of protect ourselves from that noise and 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 think about what we want from ourselves and who we want to be. um, but I think that is important, and I think also you know to I use, I think I come back to the word empathy a fair amount in the book, and it's definitely a really intrinsic part of my politics, or intrinsic to my politics. That I think um, moving through the world with empathy, um, not in a self-effacing way, but in a way that you know uh, allows us to uh, you know bear witness to other people, give as much of ourselves as we can. I think we can almost always give more we uh, than we're giving. You know and to sort of to think about life in a more mutual way, and that's coming, of course, we're talking in December of 2020, after what, 9 months of a pandemic. And so there have been a lot of conversations about mutual aid, and a lot of people doing the work of mutual aid, and a lot of and activism, and I think that's that's right. That's the lead to follow. Thinking mutually, thinking about ourselves as as really not separate from each other. There's a Judith Butler quote that I'm gonna mangle, from Precarious Life, but she says that we're undone by each other, and if we're not, we're missing something. And I that to me has always felt like a really useful and inspiring guiding principle that, um, there's, I think the only way that we make the world better is to push against the urge for insularity and just rigorous self-preservation.
Yeah. And I totally agree. And I think I'm going to jump on the word empathy that you do talk about in the book and you've mentioned here again, but it just does come down to that, doesn't it? When, as women, we need to support each other, raise each other up, especially if we're in minority groups within women.
Yeah.
And then also externally, if you're a man watching this, then you need to raise women's voices up, have empathy towards them. How would you feel if you were treated that way? And it's often in the small things as well, which it all comes down to empathy, like you say. And obviously with the pandemic and things like that, if we had empathy, then I'm sure it would have been dealt with very differently, at least in the UK.
Certainly in the United States.
I don't want to say, but also yeah.
No, please go ahead.
But that's the thing, it's very easy when, at least I think it is, when you're looking at something from afar to see everything that's going wrong and to kind of go, well, I wouldn't do it like that. But then also looking more like closer to home, maybe when I'm in meetings with other women, because there's only one space at the table, do I push myself into that space instead of helping other women into that space? And it's all about empathy and sort of, I think, raising each other up, which is I think a good quote to end on, really. I don't think you mangled it too much. I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be checked on that.
But we'll end it there. So don't forget that Rachel's book Too Much is out now, and I'll make sure I leave a link in the description. And it is definitely one of those books where every time you read something you're like, yes, or you just go, wow. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, I've enjoyed it too. Thank you so much.